Good morning, everyone. This is the April 14, 2023 meeting of the House Bill 737 Commission for the Study of Environmental and Public Health Impacts of Polyfluorinated and Perfluorinated Chemicals. I'm Chris Bandazian, chairing this meeting, and we don't have a quorum quite yet, so we will pass over the minutes, and hopefully we'll have some other members that will be able to join us and return to minutes later on in the meeting. And Kathy Beam from the Air Division has kindly agreed to come provide us with our update on how the Air Division is doing. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, thank you. So as Chairman Bandazian said, my name is Kathy Beam. I work in the Air Division, been working on this project since 2016. I thought I would just go over some of the typical pieces of information that I typically provide to Mike Wimsett when he does his updates. So, and then at the end, I'll go over kind of the permitting process because we're close to issuing a draft permit. So I just want to go through that. So for stack testing activities, there is no update. The last stack test took place last August, and so the next stack test that's required under the permit is to take place this September. And under the regulations, they're required to submit a pre-test protocol outlining how they'll operate and what stack test methods they'll use, and that's required to be submitted at least 30 days prior to the scheduled stack test date, so that'll be sometime this August. As far as bypass operations, since the last update to the Commission, Saint-Gobain has submitted 2 permit deviation reports related to bypass events. If you remember, we had quite a nor'easter on March 14th, and both of these events were related to that storm. The first occurred on March 14th. There were 5 different periods of time between about 6, 7 in the morning till about 8 in the morning, total of about 32 minutes of bypass. And according to Eversource, there was a voltage rise likely caused by a loss of a large group of customers on the same circuit transmission line attached to the circuit that feeds the facility. So that's what caused that power loss. And then the second occurred on March 16th from about 4:30 in the afternoon for a total of about 19 minutes. And again, according to Eversource, this was a result of restoring the power to a large number of customers that again caused a voltage to dip and a power interruption at the facility. In both cases, Saint-Gobain notified DES by email within 24 hours of the events and submitted permit deviation reports detailing both instances within the 10-day period that's required by rule and in their permit. Saint-Gobain has also submitted an updated air pollution control equipment monitoring plan, which they did on March 15th. There were some minor changes associated with some discussions we had with them regarding some permit conditions that we wanted to incorporate, and the monitoring plan reflects that, so nothing really major. In terms of permitting, I just wanted to see if I can show my screen here. Do I have to select which screen I'm sharing? It's been a while since I've used GoToWebinar.
Kathy, if you go to your dashboard under sharing,
Yeah.
and you see the first thing, it says show screen, you can select a drop down and choose your screen. There you go.
Does it show which screen I'm showing?
It is your background picture.
Oh.
With the tree and the, yeah.
Well, how do I
So when you do that drop down menu, it gives you an option of what monitor, and if you scroll over, it should highlight which one you're showing.
Okay. Do you see? Oh, you're going to see that one. Okay.
There we go.
How about that one? Is that the better scene? Thank you. Sorry.
Perfect.
Okay. So I just wanted to go over. Is it still showing it? Okay. I just wanted to go over the permit application review process. As the commission probably knows, there are 2 current permit applications in-house at the Air Division. The first one was the result of the department issuing a letter of deficiency to the company because of the existence of the bypass stack, which was not incorporated in the temporary permit that they're currently operating under. So they submitted an application to amend their permit to address the bypass stack back in December of 2021. Then, because their permit was due to expire in August of 2022, they submitted a application to convert the temporary permit over into a 5-year state permit to operate, and submitted that application in June of 2022. So since all of the requirements of their temporary permit to conduct stack testing, we've approved the stack testing, a monitoring plan, all of the elements that was required to be completed under the temporary permit has been achieved. The department is drafting a state permit to operate as a result of these two applications. There'll be one permit. So I just wanted to go over some of the additional, strange, okay. I just want to go over some of the additional information received from Saint-Gobain since the start of this application being received. As you know, they conducted stack testing in 2021 and submitted their report in January, and then a revised one in March of 2022. They submitted modeling as a result of those stack test results in January 2022 and a monitoring plan in February of 2022. We were reviewing all of that and then preparing again for the 2022 stack test, which occurred in, like I said, in September, and they submitted, or actually it was August, and then they submitted their final report in October and updated their modeling in November of 2022. And then recently, as early as Wednesday this week, they submitted some additional information to make some changes to a laminator that they have at the facility. So we have all of this information in-house. Let's see if I can get this to go to the next slide. There we go. So we've been conducting a technical review of the information. We've reviewed the monitoring plan and approved it. We reviewed both stack test reports and approved those. We've evaluated air emission calculations, either using stack test results or material balance information, and we've evaluated air deposition and dispersion modeling and finalized a memo related to that. And then I've gone through all of the state and federal air regulations that apply to the facility, and we prepared a draft state permit to operate with an application review summary, which is a detailed description of the facility, the emissions, and the regulations that apply to them, and calculations and the modeling report, as I mentioned. So the department prepared a draft state permit to operate with supporting information. This package of information was provided to the company for their review on January 31st of this year. This is consistent with the standard procedures followed by the department when processing an air permit application for all sources. The facility provided comments on the draft permit on March 3rd, 2023, and on March 28th, a representative from the company called DES to ask about the possibility of submitting information to amend the applications to allow for a physical modification of one of the laminators on property. As I mentioned, we received that information on April 12th, and we are currently reviewing that information to see if it is sufficient to make a determination if it will meet all applicable regulatory requirements and whether we need to make any changes to the draft permit as a result. When that review is completed, we will post a draft state permit to operate along with all that supporting documentation I mentioned. It'll be on One Stop for public to review, and we'll start a public comment period. So the typical process is that once a draft permit goes out for comment, you have a 30-day window to make comments. We're going to pre-plan a hybrid public hearing to obtain feedback from the public on the draft permit. We always have our permitting hearings in the town in which the facility is located. So we are currently starting the process of planning the public hearing to take place in Merrimack. But we want to have an online component as well to ensure the public has ample opportunity to provide comments on the draft permit. And we're anticipating that hearing will likely take place in mid to late June, depending on availability of staff and of course the location. Typically that we have that down at the upper elementary school, and they're starting to make phone calls about whether that's available in the middle of June when school's just getting out. So that's where we are with the permit. I can just stop sharing here. And that is pretty much my update. There's no new inspection activities at this time. So.
Sorry about that. Couldn't find myself on this list. Lorraine, please. Sorry to keep.
Of course, I have a question. I noticed you said that they've asked for a 5-year state permit. I don't know if that's customary, but you know, there's a lot of moving parts on the federal level. And the original, requirement by law was that they would reduce the emissions of 4 PFAS to levels that would not translate to above the water MCLs, even though the water is over that level. So, that's a point of contention in town. But now we're looking at, much lower MCLs of 4, a hazardous index, and also hazardous substance designation, including yesterday on the Federal Register adding several more PFAS of interest to Merrimack in particular. We know what they're looking at is here. So I'm curious, like, what happens? The reason is, we have they've made these deals that they're grandfathered into. So if they lock into this 5-year state permit, and the federal's starting to look at air also, which is really amazing. It's really great. They're doing great work at the EPA currently. So what happens when federal kind of tightens and looks at something, which optimistically we hope that happens sooner rather than later, but within the next 5 years, I would expect to see changes. So what happens? Like, do their conditions get locked in for 5 years? Do you revisit? Can you just help me understand how that federal translates to their activities when we get it?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. It's a good question because, as you recall, when the temporary permit was issued, it only had limits for PFOA and PFOS, and 2 other compounds became regulated after that. So the way that the air regulations are written, a temporary permit or a construction permit is good for 18 months. That's for the process of building, operating, and testing. And like I said, they've completed all the requirements of that permit. Any facility, Saint-Gobain or otherwise, that has a temporary permit can apply for a state permit to operate. That's the next step in the process of permitting. Now, that said, we have the ability through the air regulations to open any permit if a standard becomes tighter. Now, we chose not to for the 2 compounds that got new AGQSs, mostly because the emissions from the facility for those weren't really limited by the low levels of the other AGQSs. They don't emit PFHXS, so it post control. So anyway, so yes, if a new standard came out, if the standards were reduced, we can open the permit. The 5-year permit doesn't limit us to having to wait till it's up for renewal.
Thank you. Good news.
And just a reminder, the standards for their emission limitations for PFOA and PFOS are not really tied strictly to the AGQS. They're tied to the reporting levels for water sampling, which is actually around 4 parts per trillion already. So just to keep in mind that we're already limiting their emissions based on 4 parts per trillion.
Other questions? Dr. Woods.
There we go. Just what's the time lag? Lorraine's comments about the federal level and a lot of activity that I've seen through the EPA websites and in this morning's monitor. Pappas has got a bill about PFAS control, that kind of thing. How nimble can New Hampshire be, and when new standards come out? Does that require going through the legislature again? Do you have the rulemaking capacity? What does that look like time-wise?
I think what you're asking is primarily water standards, which I would let Mr. Wimsatt answer. The way the state statute is for air, it just says if there is a facility or a device that's emitting compounds that cause or contribute to an AGQS violation for PFAS, it doesn't list PFOA or PFOS specifically. So we have the flexibility as soon as an AGQS is developed in the state.
So pretty nimble.
Other questions? Don, you had a question about air emissions and persistence of PFOA, even though it's no longer in use at one of our prior meetings. So, you had a question about what the source was. So I don't know if you can answer that, Kathy.
Sure. So just to give a little background, in 2002, when the facility was emitting larger amounts of PFOA, that was prior to the stewardship agreement and the reformulation. The safety data sheets prepared for the raw materials had listed PFOA concentrations because it was around 2%. When they reformulated, they were required to reformulate below a certain concentration, and according to our consent decree, or our order, I guess it was. But in terms of reformulation of the raw materials, we have had samples of their raw materials taken on multiple occasions through each of the stack tests, as well as an independent period of time early on in this investigation. There is very small levels of PFOA. I want to say 5 to 6 orders of magnitude lower than what was detected or measured when they were actually emitting large amounts of PFOA. I think it's just a residual of the making polymers, and the concentrations now are quite low. But again, we're establishing an emission limitation based on being able to detect it in water. So those emission limits are less than a pound a year. So it's much lower than the hundreds of pounds per year that they were emitting in the past.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, so does that mean they can emit a pound a year of PFOA and it wouldn't be detected in water above the 12 MCL?
So right now their permit limits them to, I think it's 0.4, 0.5. I haven't looked at it recently, but it's less than a half a pound a year is what the permit limits them to for PFOA emissions. And that ensures that the water that would infiltrate the ground, it's kind of a complicated explanation, but that the detection level would not exceed the detection level if you were to actually sample that water. So basically we take the parameters of the facility, the terrain, the building, the meteorological history, and we model where it's going to land on a square meter area, anywhere in the area. And the highest concentration of that could land on the ground. And we look at water infiltrating into the ground, how much water typically goes into the ground here in New Hampshire, and we come up with a concentration. And we back calculate how much emissions can come from the facility so that water is not above detection level or reporting levels. So 4 parts per trillion. So half a pound a year will ensure that.
So the comparison you're using is 4 parts per trillion, not 12 parts per trillion.
Right.
Okay, any follow-up on that? Kathy, can you just go over again the public hearing schedule as we look forward to June, because people get busy in June, and the more notice we can give, the better.
Sure. So as I mentioned, they just submitted some information this week. We need to take a look at that information and decide if there's some need to amend the draft permit before we go out for public notice. So there'll be some time that'll take to do that. Once that draft permit is ready, we will put out a public notice, and it will be at least 30 days after the public notice before a hearing would be held. So they'd have a month notification on that. I was thinking that, I know you guys have a meeting, I think, second week of May and then a second week of June. I suspect that the public notice might not come out before your May meeting, but if it comes out shortly thereafter, I could come back to the June meeting to give the same presentation I would at the public hearing if you want. But the public hearing wouldn't be till the end of June.
Okay. All right. Any more questions or comments for air?
I just got one quick one. It's just a hypothetical situation. If there was a another Saint-Gobain that came and wanted to set up shop, they wouldn't be able to emit any PFOA because Saint-Gobain is maximizing the amount of contaminant PFOA that they can release into the perimeter of the study area. So they're allowed to use up all of the PFOA emission, and no one else would be allowed to piggyback on that, because if there was more PFOA emitted than in the same area, then it would exceed that 4 part per trillion. So they're just lucky to have the ability to kind of pollute the environment to the maximum allowable, where no one else could add to that. Is that a true statement?
Well, let me back up a little bit. The deposition model that we use, we put into the model what's called receptors, square meter, you know, a receptor every square meter, so that you have an idea of where all this is depositing. We picked the one area that had the highest amount of PFOA that would land in that square meter to do our calculations. So it was much less at all the other locations out from the facility. This was just the highest impact in that 1 square meter, which is pretty conservative given that we're not taking into consideration any kind of retention in the soil or any kind of modeling under the ground. And we're saying that that determines the entire limitation of the facility, even though they have less impact outside of that 1 square meter area. That being said, right now, we don't have the rules in place for this statute. We have started to draft those. And you make a good point I was going to mention, was that we want to go out to stakeholders to discuss those rules. They may, in that case, talk a little bit about interactive or how that might affect how the analysis and the rules are implemented. So a good comment. We don't have that situation right now, but we do want to get the rules in place in case that's the case in the future. So.
Thanks for that.
Any other questions or comments? Anybody? If not, we'll move on to Mr. Limsat's update. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. Just to provide the DES, the rest of the DES update, which would be the Waste Management Division's update, follow a similar format to what I usually provide for you all. And you'll recall that on the heels of a June agreement that we had with Saint-Gobain last year, we received a work plan for installation of POET systems at many properties within the consent decree area. We reviewed and approved that work plan back in late summer, and we met with the company in early September and got a revised work plan in September that we approved with some stipulations back in October. So that just gives you the lay of the land on that in terms of the history. So in late November, Saint-Gobain finalized a contract with the water filtration system installation contractor, that's Second Wind Water Systems. And they're currently working on, we believe they're working on a contract with a second contractor, but we haven't heard an update on that recently. In late November, so letters were mailed out after they let that contract in late November to a total of 229 property owners in Bedford and Merrimack, basically letting them know that the contractor would be requesting meetings for pre-installation visits to their homes and properties. And the first POET system was installed in mid-December of last year. And as of April 7th of this year, there are 135 POET systems that have been installed. Second Wind is currently installing systems at a rate of approximately 10 units per week, or 10 properties per week. And they've indicated they believe that all the POETs can be installed in less than 1 year. So they're making good progress. And again, I typically, you'll see if you look at the minutes, there's a lot of text, and a lot of it is repeated from month to month, but we leave it in there so that you have some reference material to use if you're looking at it. I won't necessarily speak all of it, but it will be there in the minutes. So I have spoken to this group over the last couple of meetings about a problem. As you know, when they install POET systems, there's a requirement under the work plan to ensure that it's working effectively, get post-treatment samples to make sure that all of the water that's being provided to the home meets all applicable standards. And they did run into a problem where they were detecting PFOS in, they take a sample right at a sampling port that's on the system, so immediately downstream of the treatment canister. And they were seeing some presence of perfluorooctane sulfonate. And I've talked to you in previous meetings about how they've been trying to figure out where that's coming from. They think it may be tied to a valve that is actually in the installation of the carbon treatment system. So they've tried to leave a longer flushing time before giving the go-ahead to, or before sampling to confirm that treatment's effective. And that seems to be reducing the frequency and concentration of PFOS, but its presence has not been fully eliminated. They're also looking at sampling from the kitchen sinks because it's further downstream where you actually get your water to drink. And they've seen some benefit with that too. So the long and the short of it is they're still working on this, trying to get to the bottom of it. The lab turnaround times have been a little bit delayed, and so there's been some delay in confirming that. But basically, the most important thing to know is that properties that get a POET treatment system do not get to continue to get bottled water until we get clear evidence that the water that's being treated by the system and delivered to the home for use and consumption meets all standards. So that's still a bit of a work in progress, but we do make sure that folks have bottled water until their treated water has been sampled and confirmed to meet all applicable standards. So Saint-Gobain is also proceeding with design work for waterline installations within the towns of Litchfield and Bedford and Merrimack. And these are areas where the either existing water lines where homes require connections to the water mains in the street, or in some areas where new water mains, short sections of new water mains need to be installed. So the design packages have been completed for the Hillcrest Road area of Litchfield, and that project has been advertised for bid. Construction for that area is anticipated to occur over this summer, with substantial completion this fall, depending on contractor and material availability. Design packages were submitted to the utility providers in January for the Merrimack and Bedford areas, and comments from the utilities are currently being reviewed by Saint-Gobain. Saint-Gobain has indicated that construction for these areas will go out to bid during this summer. Saint-Gobain is also working with the water provider and currently evaluating the feasibility of the water line extensions for the town of Londonderry. And a contract to complete a conceptual design was executed and is currently underway. We actually anticipate that conceptual design will be completed later this month, and that final decision on the feasibility of municipal water to this area will be made by Saint-Gobain after review of the submittal. So we expect to be hearing from them on that in the coming weeks. Following the transition of, or just moving on to the issue of bottled water and provision of that, following the transition of areas in Londonderry to a new bottled water contractor, the outer water calls to DES have essentially been eliminated. So we're encouraged by that. Saint-Gobain has transitioned all the homes within Londonderry to this new bottled water delivery service contractor, and we'll continue to monitor the situation. But we're very pleased that that was a real problem for some time, so we're glad to see that that's been reconciled. And then DES has been consistently receiving updated proposals from the company to remedy additional water supply wells within the consent decree area following those initial agreements in April and June of last year. So we have 3 additional submittals that were agreed to in November and February and March of this year that will provide waterline, either in most cases POETs and a few waterline connections to somewhere on the order of about an additional 60 properties. And the companies indicated that they will propose remedies for newly installed or newly identified violations through their sampling concurrent with their bi-monthly reports. So that should be something that happens on an ongoing basis rather than kind of letting them pile up and then having to try to sort something out all at once. So we expect to see that as part of their normal bi-monthly reporting to us. And then on the issue of water supply well sampling, we have that original work plan, and now we're up to 17 addenda to the work plan for water sampling. And currently, Saint-Gobain's consultant, WSP Golder, is retesting wells with PFOA results between 10 and 12, and sampling additional wells within the consent decree area. DES has over time expressed a need for additional sampling addendum to complete sampling of all the water supply wells within the consent decree area, particularly the ones that were initially sampled once and were below the standard and have not been revisited. So we're working on, we think that's probably on the order of about 800 wells. And we are expecting to get a proposal from them. I think they think they can accomplish that in about 1 year's time. So if we can get that squared up, get that going, and get that approved, that would coincide well. Keep in mind, one of the main reasons we need to have resampling wells anyways. But with the proposal of EPA's new proposed MCL at 4 parts per trillion, which EPA has indicated they anticipate they may finalize as soon as early in 2024. It would be great to get all that sampling done so that we know what universe of wells within the consent decree area that originally tested below the 12 part per trillion standard might be between that 4 and 12 number and need to be identified for provision of alternate water. So we'll be working to get that done. As far as the numbers that you'll see in the summary this year are not that different, because the last time we gave you a summary a month or so ago, we were through addendum 16, and that's where we now have addendum 17, but the timing was such that these numbers don't reflect the addendum 17. So basically, very little change in the number. I think it was just one additional property identified for sampling. So we're at 3,835 properties identified for sampling, plus whatever is in addendum 17, and that's not included here. And then there have been 3,822 access agreements that were sent, and we got a return rate of about 70% on those. That's a slight increase from the February report. And then 2,402 samples have been collected from water supply wells. That's 7 more than the February report. And 1,038 properties have been offered bottled water, and that's 6 more than the February report. And under the site investigation, Saint-Gobain's consultant conducted that long-awaited post-RTO stormwater sampling back in November. A report was submitted on that in February, and that means that, and we issued a review of that in a letter dated April 5th. And there'll be a link in the notes to that letter. And so a remedial action plan was due 120 days after the consultant received the analytical. It was tied to the date they received the analytical results for the stormwater sampling. So that means that we are owed a proposed remedial action plan by May 5th of this year. So that's just in a few weeks. And the only additional thing, I won't necessarily present them because they're not particularly compelling, but you'll recall we talked about having some graphical, the committee had asked for some graphical representations of the progress being made providing waterline remedies, POETs, and waterline installations. And those are prepared. They will be in the notes that will be published with the minutes. But basically, the bar chart will show you when you see it, that a total of about 7.6% of the POETs that are slated to be installed have been installed to date. And if you break it down by town, so far those have all been in Bedford. And there's about 11.6% of those that have been completed to date. And obviously those numbers will ramp up each month as we move into this. And on the water line side, we've got a bunch of things happening and going, but none of those, we don't show it as complete until the water line's built. service connection to the home is made and the home is tied into the water, and we don't have any of that and keep in mind, this is just with respect to the June agreement. We have hundreds of people who have been connected to water line and poets previous to that, but this is just sort of keeping track of this latest agreement that was arrived at back in June of last year. So you will see that when you see the minutes that get posted with this. And then we'll, when those are a little more compelling, I'll be happy to share them in future meetings. But for now, I'll just make sure that they're appended to the minutes. And that's what I have. Otherwise, I'm just happy to answer any questions.
Representative Mooney.
Oh, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mike, for that very thorough review.
Morning.
Sort of going a little bit off topic, but still relevant. The rebates for the filtration systems.
Yes.
Now that it's tax season, some were surprised to see that there's a federal tax attached to the rebates. And as far as I can tell, that is because it's classified as a taxable government grant.
Mm-hmm.
So my thought in bringing this up at this point is if there's anything we can do, if it's approaching our federal delegation or classifying the rebate as something other than a taxable government grant, in order to just give the rebate straight out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And we've, as you probably know, we received a lot of feedback on that. Nobody likes finding out things or any surprises at tax time. So unfortunately, the way this thing is categorized, it's a grant, it's a rebate that is made, and our Division of Administrative Services determined that it was duty bound under the law to issue 1099s to the folks who receive those, and then that begs the question: is it taxable? And typically those are taxable, but obviously everyone's tax situation is different. So what we've advised, and I know it's never satisfying for people, is that if you should consult with your tax advisor to determine whether this particular payment is taxable to you. I'm happy we looked at this and tried to figure out a way. We at least tried to provide messaging that was helpful to people as much as we could, understanding that we can't be people's tax advisors. That's not an appropriate role for any state agency. But I'm happy to report, and I think Chair Bandazian mentioned earlier that Congressman Pappas, there was an article in the Concord Monitor this morning that Congressman Pappas is advancing legislation in Congress that would explicitly, and this is how this is done because it's been done for like energy rebates and things like that in the past. The Congress can pass a law that says this category of rebate or payment or grant, however it might be termed, is exempt from taxation. And I understand his bill would actually even go back and look at this year and say, if you received a 1099 for a payment that you got this year and you had to report it and pay taxes on it in your tax return for 2022, you could then, I think, I'm conjecture on my part a little bit here, but as I read the article, it sounded like you would be able to then, when you file your 23 taxes next year, you'd be able to get that money reimbursed or credited back to you. So, no way of knowing what fate that will meet in the Congress, but it's great to know that someone in our congressional delegation is working on that. So I think that's probably, when we talked to our Department of Administrative Services about that, that's what they told us. They said, if anybody wants to make this tax exempt, it's got to be done through the federal tax system and through Congress. So it sounds like Congressman Pappas is trying to do that.
Because I have to thank Mike Strand for helping push that boulder up the hill. And we also met with Senator Shaheen's assistant, and there is another mechanism using existing law that is being investigated, so that potentially there's an agency action that can be taken at the federal level that would certainly congressional action's better, but there may be a provision in the tax code that would allow the type of relief we're looking to. So there has been progress, and that's great to see in a short period of time. So probably not by April 18th when returns are due, but hopefully help will be on the way, and we won't be adding insult to injury for people who are forced to remediate their drinking water quality. Mike, I noted in down the road, maybe you could give us an update, but in the DES review of the stormwater report, I think a concern was expressed about an outfall from DES into the Merrimack River, and a suggestion that there be detention on the site rather than an outfall into the river. So I don't
Sure.
know if you can amplify on that, but down the road, that may be an area that we'd like to look at.
Sure. Yeah. And in this case, I think that makes all the sense in the world. And also, I mean, just generally speaking, when DES regulates construction projects that disturb, more than a certain amount of earth, and they do look at stormwater, and typically the stormwater management on a parcel being developed is almost always an attempt to have all the water, basically have no net change in the amount of stormwater that leaves the property, and to have any impacted stormwater that may have contaminants of concern managed on the site in a way that doesn't result in a direct discharge to a surface water.
And I don't know if there are any changes or updates in the groundwater management permit timeline, but whether there are or aren't, if you could just reiterate what that timeline is now.
Yeah, we're still working on that. One of the things I think that is the main reason we want a groundwater management permit for any site is that we want to monitor and get regular monitoring over time for impacts to groundwater and how any remedial activities, to the extent they've been implemented, are impacting, whether they're being successful. So, we continue to discuss this with Saint-Gobain. One of the concerns, they have some genuine concerns about what it means to have a groundwater management permit in an area this large, and the standard procedure for something like this is that a groundwater management permit would encompass the whole area of groundwater, which for most of our sites is a handful of parcels as opposed to what we have here. And then you issue that groundwater management permit, and you actually file a notice in the deed that said all these properties are in an area that's subject to a groundwater management permit. As you can imagine, a lot of the people who live in these towns might not really appreciate having that, attached to their deed. There is another provision that you can use that involves town government, where some kind of zoning overlay would be made in some cases very large areas for these towns, that would basically, in lieu of a notice on the deed, in lieu of that, having say, okay, my property is within, it's in residential district, or whatever other zoning overlays may apply to it. Oh, and there's a zoning overlay that says properties in this area may have, contamination or something like that, or, depending on how it was appropriate to be worded. That may be more attractive. It still might not be all that attractive to folks. And also, just in terms of managing it, this is unlike any kind of groundwater management zone that we have ever had in New Hampshire, and I hope we never have another one again. So we're trying to sort that part out, but then we're also trying not to lose sight of the fact that having a groundwater management permit, the end goal there is not, oh, we just want to have a permit. The end goal is we want the monitoring to happen. And the monitoring that I talked about before, about going back and looking at all those wells that have only been sampled once and were below the standard, that's the kind of monitoring we want in a groundwater management permit. So one of the things we're focusing on right now is let's get the monitoring we need. Also, in order to, if we're gonna, somehow characterize a groundwater management zone, more data we have, the easier it is to do that. So we're really kind of trying to focus our efforts on getting as much sampling completed in the near term here as we can, so that we know as much as we can possibly know about the quality of the groundwater in this area. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think it's going to be some time before we sort out the actual permit piece of this. But what I'm hoping, and I think I'm encouraged, is that we're getting cooperation to do a lot more sampling in the near term here, to get more information about groundwater quality in the area.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Mike?
Yes.
I think Laureen has a question.
Yes, okay. Go ahead, Laureen.
Okay, a couple of things. One is in that revisiting of data. I think that's so important because it's been 6-7 years. For example, behind my house, Babusick Brook was tested, and then over near Bean Road, and there was a culvert there. So there's 2 data points that I could walk to very quickly. And I know they were maybe 37 and 29 parts PFOA alone. And there's more than PFOA, as we know. So, you know, when that hasn't ever been tested, I think that's really important. And that brings me to, is there a way to expand this when we talk about monitoring in a groundwater management zone, which really hasn't been formalized with Saint-Gobain? I realize that, but I know your preference is that the responsible party take on the work plans, but that's what makes it go so slow, right? Like we look at behind Kids Cove off of Denny Webster Highway, waterways there. I don't think that was ever tested. I'm not really sure, but there are foam occurrences there. And, you know, I am a naturalist type person. I know the difference between natural occurring, and I noticed like yesterday, you know, when we had that wind agitating a certain way, I'm here working at home, but I'm not there. And I know after those type of events, we see this building still of this, you know, that fluffy white that just kind of lofts. So it isn't about, you know, runoff and seasonal and water flow necessarily. So can we check that area? You know, that can we check that foam? It isn't a big price to do even one, you know, that would satisfy people. And, you know, we talk about the fish advisories in the state. It was a random sampling. We have one body, I think, in New Hampshire, I mean, in Merrimack, that if it did get posted, I think it was supposed to, but we can assume that every body in this area really should have a fish advisory. And, you know, the fish sampling, you know, they wiggled out of that for years. You know, we were really concerned about that. Then they said the fish were too small, the fish were mating, it wasn't the right time of year. That was 4 years ago, you know, 5 years ago was the last excuse I heard from them. So those are important data points to our community. You know, people do, we still bring, I hear it from people, they bring it up here and there, and it's important to look further. So that's, I hope those things are also considered in your requests for what goes into the monitoring. That's one piece. And the other piece is just a comment that, I don't know, it's just a little weird thing that I have in my head, hearing about those systems with the PFOS. Could you find a way that someone could test that gap? Because it really does occur to me is we're so many years into this issue as a nation, and you know, across the nation, the majority of sites are DOD, huge amounts of PFOS. And, you know, we're starting to see that gap go back, and they're trying to figure out what to do, you know, with all this across the nation. So it's being whatever they do to regenerate it. And I wonder what we're getting, you know, you can't just go to the GAC mine and get fresh GAC for every system, right? It's clearly starting to become a circular economy within itself. And the NSF certification probably still says they just have to go under 70, right? So technically they can put that in there. So I'm real curious about testing the GAC. Just, I'd love to see that. That's it.
I'll take your questions in reverse order since we're on the GAC. So I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that GAC that is used for potable water is typically first use. It's and again, there's no GAC mine. It's right. Manufactured either from, some of it's manufactured from coal, some of it's manufactured from coconut shells. There's a bunch of different sources of carbon to manufacture GAC. But my understanding is that the GAC that is used in these carbon treatment canisters for property, you know, for treatment of properties, is not something that's been regenerated. And typically the regenerators, as I understand it, they do regenerate carbon, but it typically then goes to some industrial use after that, rather than coming back into a potable water use. Again, not an expert on that, but that's my understanding. I don't believe, you know, that Saint-Gobain and our staff have been looking at this issue. I don't think we believe that it's coming from the carbon itself. We did, again, they did do some studies that sort of exercised one of these valves, and we did see PFOS coming from that. So somewhere, for whatever reason, the manufacturers somehow got, you know, some amount of PFAS involved in the manufacturing chain somewhere along the line. And we're trying to run that to ground and sort that out. So there's still work being done to sort that out. Keep in mind that the detections that, are above standards are at that sampling port, which is not where people get their drinking water from. And when we go further downstream, so to speak, in the house, we don't see those detections above standards, and most of them weren't above standards anyway. So not to diminish the problem, we got to get it run to ground and get it solved, but I don't think it's, my understanding is no information that I've seen suggests that it's actually the GAC itself that's causing the problem. If we go back to your first question, yeah, it's a great question. And I think that one thing to keep in mind is that a groundwater management permit, often many of our groundwater management permits do also include sampling of surface water that could be impacted by contaminated groundwater, because obviously they're connected to one another. So certainly, I don't know where we're going to land exactly, but certainly possible that the groundwater management permit, and more importantly, the groundwater sampling and water quality sampling plan that will come out of this will likely include surface water bodies as well. So that would not be anything new, and that's something that we often do. As far as looking at it in a larger context, I think that's something that we probably need to be thinking about and trying to figure out. I mean, one thing we've been focusing on, we're most concerned about where people get exposed to this in a way that could harm them. And the most direct and significant contact exposure is through drinking water. So that's where we really focused our efforts. But we will need to be looking at these surface water impacts as well.
Well, we know we have concentration in fish tissue, right? That's higher than the water that they swim in. And right. I have no idea, how many people catch and release and how many people catch and go and cook that fish. And,
yeah,
and people may do it anyways, but it just bothers me that they aren't. I try to, message it to people when I can in a way that says, you like to fish, that's great, but just consider this. So I don't want to tell them what to do. It's their choice. And, especially, where kids are involved and stuff like that. So that just bothers me because I know, Fish and Game stock the waterways in this area. They stock the brook and stuff with trout and various things. And we're putting fish into contaminated water and people are catching them, and X amount of people are definitely eating them. And the chart that you have and the chart that Michigan has, and anything I see the equivalent of one fish can be, it really is a significant pathway if you are a fisher person that eats fish. So.
Yeah, this is a timely question because we're going to be joined with John Vitale here to talk about specific efforts to do some additional fish collection and sampling. I do want to note, and I'll turn it over to John because he's really the expert on this, but the issue of fish consumption is a complex one, and even before anybody knew what PFOA or PFOS stood for, we have had for a number of years fish consumption advisories in various parts of the state and across the state that are tied to concerns about atmospheric mercury and its impacts to our waterways and getting into fish. So there are already, sadly, some limitations and pretty strict guidance on how much anybody should eat, and certainly particularly vulnerable populations like children and pregnant women, to a point where it really doesn't make sense for them to be eating wild-caught fish in the state. But PFAS has no doubt impacted that analysis and that issue even further. I would note that the typical compound that we see in fish that's of concern is PFOS, and that has not been a significant component of the water quality problems that we have in southern New Hampshire that have been tied to this project. They've been mostly related to PFOA. So that doesn't make you any more comfortable when you find out that there's significant PFOS in fish. But I'll leave it at that because John Vitale is a lot more expert on this than I am. And when it gets to him, I think you can pose your questions to him.
I think maybe, I don't know if this can be done or not, maybe, testing, monitoring, it costs money. Is there a way we can cut to the chase and just come up with some signage that doesn't say it's really there, but just says precautionary? It could be, this could be present in the area, please, da, 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 da. It shouldn't be up to us to prove it. That's been a theme all along. We have to prove the harm before we can get any supports a regulatory action. And you know, that'll take the rest of my life to do that. I'm tired. I've been on this thing a long time. So maybe we can creatively think about, is there some signage that would be acceptable to people? You know, of course, it's not acceptable if somebody feels the finger is pointed to them and it causes them liability. That's where the resistance is. But, you know, it's just something that people should know, so they could say, oh, I might want to catch and release, you know, or I might want to look into that, or I might want to just err on the side of caution. Also, the deer hunting in the area, you know, I saw a hunter 2 months ago who, you know, they get called when there's a deer that they can come pick up, that whatever happened to the poor deer, and they get it and harvest the meat. There's a woman in town that's really rocks hunting and meat cutting. She really does. And somebody had something over in the area of, you know, the town landfill. And she said, you know, that's a hot spot. You know, I don't know. I think you might want to just pass on that. That was really interesting to read someone giving that advice, who will always go and take the deer and harvest the meat. I was kind of pretty impressed by her precautionary approach. So that's another thing, you know, we've looked at this on the Seacoast. We haven't done the deer sampling in this area. You know, they've lived here, they're drinking the water, they're eating the, you know, grass and on and the whole bit. So I just think we could do better there, you know, just to, even if it's an educational, you know, type of, did you know we have found this in areas across the country? It could be really vague, but, you know, people need to know how to protect themselves.
Sure. Well, DES has a standard poster that is posted at lots of boat launches around the state that discusses what we know already about our fish advisories for mercury, and in some focused locations in the Androscoggin River, south of Berlin, downstream of Berlin, dioxin. So that kind of institutional approach already exists, right? And I think certainly as we learn a little more about PFAS, that poster, that standard poster, could be modified to include something like what you're talking about. I think that's a really helpful.
Look at the map of the state, right? You have that state map with the dots all over the state. So when I look at that map, I just say, geez, we have to do something like that. Great, take it under, take it to your people. So it'll be wonderful to see that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mike Strand.
You're muted, Michael.
There we go. My technological prowess never ceases to amaze. Quick question, Mike, and there's probably no direct answer, but do you have any idea of ballpark when the negotiations surrounding the proposed GMZ might be done or close to done or have some resolution?
I don't really have a date for that. What I will say is I think we are getting to a point much more on a much tighter timeline to get more sampling going, which is what we really want here. So, sure. You know, the bad news is I think when we get the actual, you know, institutional device all set up and figure out what a groundwater management permit's going to look like, it could be some time. But in terms of getting the kind of sampling that we want to have, I think that's much closer.
Okay, that makes sense. And then getting on the weeds, getting in the weeds on this, excuse me. I was really interested to hear your comment that there could be potential avenues for like town ordinance or local action with zoning overlays. And I just want to, I guess I don't know the best way to phrase this. I mean, my assumption was always that any ordinance that would potentially obligate, you know, obviously not a responsible party, but you know, somebody who was remediating water contamination in an area, you couldn't run something that would be parallel, you know, or potentially contradictory to a consent decree or to DHS action, correct? In terms of requiring things, that's not where you're going with that, right?
Yeah, keep in mind that doing a groundwater management zone established by ordinance it's not really, I mean, it's an ordinance because that's the technical term for when or a zoning ordinance, but it's really just about notice. It's not about requiring anybody to do anything or limiting anyone's use of their property or their well. It's just about notice, an alternate way to provide notice. So the idea is that, you know, the reason that we in a typical circumstance want to make sure that a groundwater management zone is is recorded with a property deed, the note, in the chain of title, is so that the person who lives there probably already knows, they're probably already having their well sampled or they've had notice. But then when they sell it, there's no sort of mechanism for a heads up buyer to understand that unless the realtor or the property owner is forthcoming and shares that information, which often doesn't happen. So the advantage of using a zoning overlay in lieu of a notice is that you can accomplish the same thing. But again, it still requires that people, looking to buy property, do a heads-up workman-like title search. If you do a heads-up title search, in addition to reviewing, the chain of title, you should also be looking at zoning overlay and that sort of thing. So it's not perfect. No system is really perfect. I mean, even a notice in the deed isn't perfect if someone buys a piece of property without doing a title search, right? Yeah. So really, it's just about trying to make sure that with the mechanisms we have available to us, people, either current residents or people who look to purchase a property, have fair and adequate notice that there may be a condition that they should, at the very least, be aware of or be concerned about.
Thank you. No, that definitely clarifies that. And then last quick thing, and this may not be the time or place, so I'll defer to Chris and Laureen. I don't know, is there a section later for, and I didn't see an agenda, I apologize, for the communications subcommittee to share an update or to share any updates from, citizen concerns or anything like that?
There will be now.
It will be now. Okay. All right. Well, then let me, I'm going to go muted again and keep moving. Thanks.
All right. Dr. Patali, did you disappear?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure when I'm going on and off mute. I'm actually up here at Mount Washington. I'm waiting for Nancy Murphy because we're going to talk to the Nurse Practitioners Association. So hi, I am going to be joined here hopefully by Dr. Celia Chen from Dartmouth and Nate Gifford. I don't know if they're present, and if so, if Amy could promote them.
I have promoted Celia. I don't see that Nate is on any longer. Do you want me to share your slide?
Yes, if you could, that'd be super helpful. So hi everyone, I'm John Spitali. I'm the toxicologist at DES, and those are Amy's adorable children. So I'm joined here right now by Dr. Celia Chen from Dartmouth College, and we have a specific request that is actually very timely given Laureen's questions about fish and fish sampling. And it's essentially an opportunity to try to get some engagement and some help from the community. So with that, I'm going to ask if Celia could jump on, briefly introduce herself, and talk a little bit about the project.
Yeah, hi. I don't know. I have never used GoToWebinar before, so I am here. I don't know whether you, oh, there you can. Can you see me now? Yeah. Thanks for letting us take a moment of your time. John and I and a couple other collaborators at Middlebury and at Clarkson University, we have a grant from the USGS to do a study on 6 lakes in southern New Hampshire. We identified those lakes from the work that New Hampshire DES has done and chose 5 of the lakes that had high concentrations of PFAS in fish, and we chose a 6th lake that had high concentrations of PFAS in loon eggs. And so we are this summer going down there to sample, and we have never been to these lakes before. I for many years have been a mercury researcher, and now PFAS is the contaminant of the hour. So we have studied a lot of lakes in New Hampshire, but not these particular 6 lakes. So we don't actually know, access points at this point. We're going to do some reconnaissance in May. And one of the things that we really could use some help with, because it is always the hardest thing with aquatic sampling, is getting fish samples. We hoped to get samples of planktivorous fish, as well as a few fish that eat plankton, and a few fish species that are, recreationally caught fish. And so we're reaching out to lots of different groups and hoping that we could get people interested in going, well, hopefully they are fishing already and possibly donating some of their fish to our effort. You know, we would be collecting up the fish and then we would bring them to our lab and we do, you know, fillet, depending on the types of fish. If they were tiny fish, we probably do whole body. If we have the larger fish, we would do, you know, pieces of fillet. And then we extract them at our lab at Dartmouth, and then we send them over to Clarkson University for analysis of 40 PFAS compounds. And we've been doing some of this already in Great Bay in association with the former Pease Air Force Base. So, you know, we have our methodologies, but we're really interested, in addition to the fish, and learning what are the PFAS compound profiles and and concentrations in the food web. That's what we are as food web scientists. And so we want to know, you know, how much and what kind are in the sediments and in the water and in the plankton. And so that's kind of what our larger project is, but given that it is very time consuming to get larger fish, especially, we hoped that maybe we could get some interest in the larger community. And so this slide that is being shared is, you know, the details of our, you know, which lakes we're studying, which species we're looking for, and how can, you know, the community help us in reaching our goals of getting enough tissue samples. Is that what I was supposed to say, John?
Okay, so with that, are there any questions or any thoughts or anything that anyone wants to share from the commission? Essentially, we came with the idea of reaching out to all of you, since each of you are connected to your various communities across this area. You may know recreational fishers that will be going out to some of these ponds, and just some of that local knowledge would be really helpful.
I think,
yes, and you can, oh, sorry.
I think, you know, people in the area, I don't think that's, you know, there's only one data point in their whole vastly PFAS contaminated area. What bothers me is the Seacoast area is really definitive of where, you know, there's contaminants. It's a good sampling area. Then we're looking at New Hampshire and it's too broad. So like if I were to ask people in town, you know, hey, would you like to catch some fish or donate a fish? They would say, sure. There's a lot of people would do that, but they have their particular places that they fish, you know, for a reason. So I would love to see, I guess it's too late, a grounds up study that really says, where do you fish in your community? Please donate a fish and we'll sample it. That would really be informative, but that may not be helpful to you. So I don't think horseshoe is a big, huge fishing point, you know, some, but not
so in
that are bigger.
So Lorraine, to your point, you know, we try to do that with mercury in the state because we actually have a mercury analyzer. But when it comes to organic contaminants like PCBs and PFAS, we've simply not been funded to do that work at the DES labs, because that would be very expensive to get that equipment set up to be able to do that analysis. So as far as doing that sort of volunteer, like what are people catching, we'd like to be able to do that, but that's been a repeated issue of when we look for the funding for that, there's just no support for it. The reason we're focusing specifically on these ponds, though, is if we can make the connections from concentrations that are in water and sediment and living organisms in the same pond all the way up through the food web, it makes it easier for us to predict what is going on in other ponds based on easier to sample measurements like water. That's why we targeted these lakes, because these lakes have data from the Loon Preservation Committee, who is sharing their loon eggs with us, which is the top of the food chain predator. And if we can catch fish and collect water and sediments and even some surface layer foams that we're going to be looking at dabbling with this in this experiment, if we can make those connections, it'll be easier for us to make it broadly applicable to other lakes. If we have disjointed data where it's fish from one lake, water from another lake, and then sediment from a third lake, we can't do anything with that besides say there's PFAS in this lake or in that sediment. And that's one of the ideas behind this study is if we can keep the sampling focused within these water bodies, it makes it easier for us to predictably look at other water bodies based on things that are easy and cheaper to measure, like water or sediment samples. So again, it's not a wide testing program. That would be ideal, but again, it's several $100s to analyze one fish. So, you know, we've made multiple requests. You know, we've talked with Ted Deers over in the water division about, you know, what it would look like to do that sort of broader sampling if people could bring in any fish from anywhere. But this is a unique opportunity that we had for funding from the USGS to really pursue and understand these connections and these relationships. Dr. Woods?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the difficulties, both personnel and financial constraints to have a broad study, which would really be very nice. But just hearkening back to the DDT problem and the eagles and their eggs, and that didn't identify a source per se, but just identified a problem. So I just sort of advocating to some degree that sampling, at least at a minimal level around the state, would at least indicate to some degree the ubiquitous character of PFAS, or whether it really is localized to the generating origins. Again, if even if a small, you know, survey, shall we say, that's a wrong term to use, but a small sampling, if that were to show that it's more ubiquitous than we thought, even in areas that are not even closely related, then that would give us food for thought.
Well, so Dr. Woods, these lakes that we're going to be studying that are on this slide are a subset that DES had actually sampled back in 2019 going into 2020, where we did include lakes from the North Country area, so up like past Winnipesaukee, and PFAS were found there. And in other states where they have sampled remote areas that they believe are away from sources of PFAS, they detect PFAS. So again, that would be one of the issues of if we were to take a qualitative approach and say, let's put out signs on any water body where we think there's going to be PFAS and fish. At this point on Earth, if you have fish, you have PFAS.
Yeah, okay. I my apologies for not being familiar with those studies.
No, that's fine. And again, we were just trying to keep this as brief as we could because we realized the commission was busy. But again, like we did an initial survey, and this is Dartmouth and partners at USGS, Clarkson College, building on that data that DES generated so we could really go after these food web relationships.
So we can really honestly tell folks that PFAS is truly ubiquitous.
Yep.
Other questions or comments, please? I am going to be taking the minutes, so if the department reports can be forwarded to me, but in particular, if this slide can be made available, I think it would be good to distribute through our governing bodies. It's very well laid out and simple and easy to follow, and maybe we'll get some summer vacationers enthusiastic about catching some perch. Only other question is, what size are you contemplating?
Celia, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think we were aiming for what is within the legal catch size limit. So if recreational fishers just want to follow that guidance.
Okay.
Is that correct, Celia, or are we just going for every fish that we can get?
No, we were targeting the ones that, you know, people would potentially consume.
Got you. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for Celia and Dr. Patali for that update.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to run off now. If anyone needs me for anything, just shoot me an email. So thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, next up is Dr. Bush, and before Dr. Bush gets to speak, I just want to say what a privilege it's been for me and for all of us to have worked with Dr. Bush for the last 3.5 years on this problem. She's been a real stalwart in increasing our understanding and carrying out the mission for the state. So we're sadly say goodbye to Dr. Bush after this meeting. and she's headed west to greener pastures, we hope.
Thanks for those remarks. Hi, everyone. Just for those that haven't heard the news, I'll be leaving my position here with the New Hampshire Environmental Public Health Tracking Program and taking a new position at the New York State Department of Health Center for Environmental Health as the Director of Strategic Operations. And like I said in a note to Rosemary and Nancy and some others that I had a chance to connect with, it's really been an honor to work with you. You know, I'm sad for the circumstances that bring us together, really addressing this environmental issue, but it has been some of the most rewarding work that I've been a part of in my 8+ years with the state of New Hampshire. So, and PFAS are everywhere, and so I imagine that the lessons I've learned and all that you have taught me about community engagement and scientific analysis, you know, I'll carry that with me to my work in New York, where they also have some of the most important PFAS work going on. So thank you for your work, and I wish you well. The one real exciting update I have is that while John is presenting just in a couple minutes at the Nurse Practitioner Conference, they will be sharing a draft version of a PFAS healthcare provider fact sheet that we've been working on for a very long time. So it is not final yet. It's sort of in that final stage. We had hoped to have a final version to distribute, but we're getting it right. We're really taking our time to sort of craft the message and hopefully make this a digestible and accessible information sheet that will be distributed to healthcare providers. And so they're going to do a little bit of just sort of user testing at this conference through a very short survey that just asks folks about, is this the type of information that's useful? Can you see the value of incorporating this type of work into your practice? And perhaps most importantly, like, how can we distribute this information effectively to providers across the state? So that survey will hopefully get distributed here coming up at the lunchtime meeting, and then we will have that information at our fingertips as we get this finalized and then work to disseminate it. So in the end, there's a lot of information that we think providers should know. I think it's going to end up being a 4 or 5 page sort of fact sheet with many, many links to other resources from federal partners like ATSDR or EPA and other resources. So I know this has been something that this commission has wanted for a long time, and I'm excited that, you know, in my last few weeks, I can make sure that it's in the hopper and sort of on its way out the door to all of you. It will, of course, need to be changed probably soon, but it will be a work in progress, you know, based on the work coming out of our federal partners. So that's really exciting. And I know it's been a long time coming, so I am excited that we'll be able to deliver that to you and to our partners.
Dr. Woods, to you.
Yeah, just is that going to go to the medical society as well?
Yeah, that would be our plan, would be to sort of touch all of the associations and have it disseminated through their listservs. But then also look for opportunities perhaps to participate in grand rounds at Dartmouth or other places, or the PASU. So yeah, we'll definitely put together sort of a dissemination plan and would welcome feedback from all of you on how to reach the right people with this information.
Is it possible for those of us on the committee? I would certainly like to get a copy of that to review. If that's possible, I would really like that.
Great. I will make that a note. And my supervisor and our bureau chief here of Public Health Protection, Michelle Roberge, she'll be taking my place on the commission going forward. And as you can imagine, I'm doing a massive sort of download to her at this point. So I'll make sure that that opportunity to share that fact sheet and get feedback is on her list.
And thank you for your service and my terms in the legislature. I appreciated your presentations as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My only other update is related, and this may start to creep into Representative Mooney's domain, but is around an update on HB 614. That's the bill that would appropriate $500,000 to the department to support the phase 3 feasibility study of the ongoing cancer investigation in Merrimack. So it's in the budget. We've gotten it as far as we can, and that's thanks to a lot of collaborative work from many members of both houses and the Senate. And so we'll continue to watch the budget. We hope it makes it through the upcoming negotiations. And we're sort of primed and ready to work on what will be some contract language to support that work going forward. So we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll be ready to spend that money effectively and efficiently through a contract with a research organization or higher ed institution, and hopefully continue that work that we've started with all of you to understand better what's going on around kidney cancer in the region. And I think learn a lot more about other co-occurring health outcomes as a part of that work. So that's all I have. And yeah, thank you again. It's really been a privilege to work with all of you over the years, and I wish you well in your continued endeavors.
Good luck to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bush. Representative Mooney, perfect segue to our legislative update. That's great news on 614. I think that's it's so critical to keep momentum on the health study.
Absolutely. That was a great segue. And good morning once again. As for the 12 bills we've been tracking this session, this year, and I've updated the chart this week, 3 of those bills are included in the budget, House Bill 2. So they are in sections 31 of House Bill 2, section 350, and then section 416, starting there. So it's critically important at this point that the budget we so carefully put together in the House that passed on a voice vote, first time in anybody's memory, critically important that the state senators be aware of these particular sections of House Bill 2 so that they're preserved in House Bill 2 on the Senate side. So if there are any senator staffs listening or on the call, if they could just be sure to bring these sections to the senator's attention. As for the other bills, 3 have made it on their own to the other chamber, though 1 was voted ITL in the other chamber, leaving 2 moving forward. So the 2 that are continuing to be alive are House Bills 214, House Bill 214, and Senate Bill 125. And just to be clear, the sections I mentioned in House Bill 2, the 3 bills that are contained in House Bill 2 are, probably easiest and quickest to do it by numbers. They are House Bill 614, as Dr. Bush mentioned, House Bill 212, and House Bill 311. So House Bill 614 is in section 416. No coincidence there, same numbers, just in a different order. House Bill 212 is in section 350, and House Bill 311 is in section 31, all in House Bill 2. So really good year, once again, for PFAS legislation, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're muted, Chris.
All right. Subcommittee updates very quickly, Mike. Do you have a communications committee update?
Oh, I'm sorry, was that me, Chris?
That's your cue, yes.
I apologize. So just quickly, I wanted to share 2 concerns I recently heard, and these are redundant, so will come as no surprise to to anybody. But just kind of a couple specific stories, and as we work towards everything that I know Mr. Wimsott is doing, to get a GMZ put in place. Obviously we're awaiting the changes in in federal regulatory MCLs, and so a lot of this is in process and will happen, but want to share anyway. I think the 2 biggest concerns I have coming out of Bedford anyway from affected citizens, one, and this is a big one, and Representative Mooney, maybe there is a legislative solution for this. I don't know. I have broached this with our state senator and state reps, and we'll continue to do so. But for people who are inside, property owners or well users inside the consent decree that are over MCL, but they did not want to wait. to install either reverse osmosis or a POET system. Understandably, the small kids, health concerns for their family, a lot of folks didn't wait, and they bit the bullet and they paid for these things themselves. The way that the current agreement, to the best of my knowledge, and from as far as what I've heard from people, is structured, is such that Gobain will only install the POET themselves. So I actually spoke to one property owner the other day who, and we escalated this as well. Mike, you may have seen this. Their issue was Gobain offered to basically replace our whole house filtration system or POET system that we already have that was installed a year ago. And there is no path for reimbursement for those folks who did it on their own and are inside the consent decree over MCL. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I just wanted to escalate that, that concern to the commission. The other one is, and this is a little more personal, consent, property owners, well users inside the consent decree who are under MCL, but over this potential pending, federal MCL of 0.04. We're very close. Some people are, 0.1, 0.09, 0.08, potentially double what the science and new federal regulation would suggest is safe. So I have a friend, he actually plays on my basketball team, 3 young kids, 1 newborn, put in a reverse osmosis system himself, for, obvious concerns, had a pregnant wife for the last year. And, obviously it was, it was point of use. So, from a cooking standpoint and drinking water standpoint, they're covered in getting an ND reading, but, he's still, he texted me the other day, was genuinely worried. He said, "Hey, should I be worried about this? We're still brushing our teeth and showering with this stuff." And, I tried to, to be, moderate, and temper some of the concerns and say, hey, you're probably okay. You're below, the state MCL anyhow. But I still at least wanted to, to escalate what I'm hearing and some of these concerns, which are real, because, I believe these are kind of 2 of the gaps, in the existing agreement. So I just wanted to kick that uphill to you, Mike, as you continue to go through these discussions, That was it.
Okay. I guess to Mike's point about people who have installed POETs on their own because they didn't want to wait as long as it's taking. It would seem to me, at least with the treatment systems, there's got to be an average cost to Saint-Gobain that they'll be able to figure out pretty recently. And there would be no impact on them whether somebody got it done on their own. If they simply paid that average amount, it wouldn't be possibly the full amount, but it certainly would seem to be an equitable action on their part, as opposed to requiring the private individual to seek restitution by their own means. But I don't know if they'd be willing to do that, but it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think that was
public relations,
Chris. I think it's, it's just a question of, it's something that they're going to install it anyway. They're going to incur that cost anyway. It would be a good faith thing if they consider it. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for that question. This is something that we have for some time in discussing with the company. We've expressed concern about it. I'm not sure where they're at exactly. I'm getting some indication that we may get some movement on this, and we're cautiously optimistic that there may be some movement on it. I do want to take the opportunity, though, to also, as with most things, it's always a little more complicated than we'd like, right? So one of the problems is that, the reality is that there's no licensing of water treatment installers, right? So anybody can do it. And you get, as with anything like that, you're going to get a variety of quality and a variety of iterations of it that are different. One of the problems that the company has experienced in going into these homes where a POET has already been installed by another contractor is that in some cases they're not done quite right, or they're not done in a way that will facilitate. Keep in mind that if you are above the standard and you're inside the consent decree, not only are you entitled to have Saint-Gobain provide a installation of a POET for you, but you're entitled to long-term care and maintenance of that conducted by the company and its contractors. And so when Saint-Gobain looks at that and they suddenly see an installation that they either can't or would be very difficult or expensive to maintain, that's a problem. So we really encourage people, you know, and we understand it's frustrating, but to work with a company to make it, if they're entitled to a POET system, they really should be getting that installed by the company's contractor, and so it'll be ready to be maintained. I mean, in one case, there was no sampling port between the cartridges, so there's just, you know, fundamental problems. And then, so it's frustrating to the homeowner when, even if Saint-Gobain says, yeah, we'll fix it, but, you know, do they have, they're asking themselves the question, do they have the responsibility to pay for another contractor's, as they see it, poor quality work, right, or inadequate work? So it's more complicated than we ever like, but having said all that, we have expressed this concern to the company, and we think we are aware that they are looking at this and trying to come up with a solution. So I can't tell you when exactly that's going to happen, but we continue to encourage them to resolve this as best, you know, as advantageously as they can for the people that are impacted.
That's encouraging, Mike. One thing I can offer, and I will be very hesitant in disclaimer this, that you're certainly not speaking on behalf of everybody affected, but one potential avenue that I certainly could see, you know, people being, you know, finding acceptable or more acceptable or being amenable to, and could be a relative, you know, financial win for Saint-Gobain would be, you know, a simple waiver, you know, where Gobain would not be obligated to maintaining, you know, the long-term, you know, cost of that system in return for reimbursement, and not, you know, being liable for, you know, potentially, you know, the outcome of that filtration system. I know that, you know, wouldn't necessarily be ideal, you know, in terms of long-term sampling outcomes, but I think people would probably jump at that, would be, you know, my sense from those I talk to, but, you know, I don't know, that's all kind of hypothetical.
I think that's something that certainly an individual property owner and the company could work out between them, and we wouldn't try to stand in the way of that. I will tell you, from the agency's perspective, we're not enthusiastic about people giving up their right to have Saint-Gobain maintain these systems. And the reason for that is a public health reason, is that even the most well-intentioned homeowners who are clearly trying to protect their family, you know, human nature being what it is, we'd love to build and install things, but we don't like taking care of them, right? And so there are lots of cases where otherwise very responsible people, you know, have got a GAC cartridge in their basement that's 7 years old. And that can be far more dangerous than the hazard they're trying to protect against, because if you start not maintaining these things, you can get bacteria buildup, you can also have the very contaminants you're treating for desorbing and bleeding back into your system in much higher concentrations than they would have been if you just didn't treat it at all. So it's really, you know, we see ourselves as essentially, our mission is about protection of public health and the environment. So when we have a situation where state law requires a responsible party to provide long-term care and maintenance of a system, we don't want to discourage that. So, you know, again, what we want to see is these folks, you know, the company providing these systems, them being workmanlike, well-designed and maintained systems, and then that maintenance going on for as long as is necessary to ensure safe safe drinking water.
I completely understand that. I appreciate that perspective, which is, you know, really the right thing for you guys to do. I just think the very pragmatic logic coming from affected people is, you know, and even in the case of folks who are still on bottled water for, you know, 3-4 years and haven't gotten the system yet, I think they're kind of like, what's the difference? You know, so I think that's you know, however, not maybe the best long-term thinking. I think that's, you know, where we're getting some of those reactions, if that makes sense, you know.
Well, and the other piece is that I would not, you know, discount the fact that it's not free to provide this ongoing operation and maintenance. So when an individual property owner is looking at it, they're just looking at the dollars and cents. Getting a reimbursement for what they put in and then having to take care of that themselves may not be such a good financial trade-off either. They might be better off to, you know, just get in the club, so to speak, and have that long-term care provided.
I'll make sure I share that. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. No environmental subcommittee update. Any health subcommittee updates? Right, seeing none, I want to come back to the minutes. For the February minutes, Dr. Wood's position and mine were clarified in our discussion in March, and I added an addendum on our Attorney General Alan Brooks segment. And so I'd like to have a motion to approve the minutes as amended. Motion by Don. Is there a second by Dr. Woods? Any discussion?
Oh, yes, I actually, on the page 2 of the supplemental minutes, I think it's the 3rd paragraph. No, it's not that one. Hold on a second. It's where, I guess it's the 1st paragraph. Let's see, question, PFAS is still being detected in stack testing. I think there's 3 instances of the word or the acronym PFAS. I was specifically referring to PFOA, just to be clear. So I think that should all say PFOA. I was asking about the PFOA and Saint-Gobain stacks. Obviously, there's PFAS being emitted, but I was specific to the PFOA portion of the PFAS.
Gotcha.
Other than that, that's all I had.
And so Don, it's your motion. So Dr. Woods, do you second the amendment to the amendment? Okay. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Okay. Any opposed? That motion carries. And then we have the minutes of the March meeting. And if we can have a motion to approve those minutes. Motion by Don. Is there a second by Dr. Woods? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hands. All right. Thank you, everybody. Our next meeting is May 12th at 10 a.m. I will look and see if an afternoon session is better. We've unfortunately excluded some people, but given the great attendance in the morning, I don't think that's very likely. So please plan on a 10 a.m. meeting. And with that, best wishes from all of us, Dr. Bush, to you and your family. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks.